In this video, I want to talk about the opening passages of Martha Nussbaum's work, Women in Human Development, the Capabilities Approach, which I'll just abbreviate by CA for Capabilities Approach. Now, this is a large work, and I'm just going to do a couple of videos just to kind of give you a flavor of what's going on in this work. In the introduction, she makes the case for the claim that women's basic needs, like in general, are not being met. Now, she's going to focus on developing nations, but she thinks she has a universalist account of everything she's saying. So she's got a feminist line, but a universalist take on things, and that gets her into some tension with some feminist thought, but we'll look at that a little later in the video, her response to that tension. Okay, so again, have a look at the case for this claim that women's basic needs are not being met. And so I'm not going to go through that. But then she says, okay, well, with that idea, if that goes through, then this section 2 that I'm going to talk about in this video, I'll talk about section 3 in another video, just an overview of this capabilities approach. It's not going to be very clear yet, but she's sketching the outlines of it. So first off, this is a universalist. This is a philosophical approach. She says, look, I'm not a sociologist. I don't have like piles of data. I'm not doing data analysis and all that. I am a philosopher who is sensitive to empirical conditions, but we need philosophy. She's big on this, right? She's like, look, there's just certain things that philosophical analysis in its right kind of abstract analysis that is attentive to empirical situations, that combination of philosophical attention to abstract analysis and philosophical attention to the empirical situation produces a kind of analysis that you just don't get when you jettison philosophy altogether. So she's saying we need philosophy for this universalist notion. A couple of things that she doesn't argue for, but she imports. And everybody does. That's how you get knowledge processes, building processes off the ground. You have to presume something to get them going. So what is the stuff that she's bringing to the table and using in her discussion? Well, first off, she is largely, not really arguing that we need philosophy, but making this sort of claim. And she's like, also human beings, they have dignity. So she's well in the tradition, of Kant and the gang, where there is some kind of dignity that human beings have. And she's not going to argue for it or in any of that. She's just saying human beings have dignity. The problem is how to show this dignity, this human dignity, proper respect. Humans also are ends, right? Not means to an end, they are ends. And right, so again, this is very Kantian, right? So everyone is an end in and of himself, in an end of herself, or whatever. Then they're not to be treated as means to other ends, right? So human beings aren't things to use, right? That's a wrong way. That's an immoral way, like you're using people. They have dignity. Human beings are ends in themselves. That's her basis. And she also slips in this notion, an intuitive idea of a life that is worthy of a human being, right? Because, human beings have dignity, and there is, again, we all seem to have this, like when we think, oh, I'm not living a good life here. Well, where'd you get that from? We tend to walk around with notions, however they're formed, but most people pretty well have an idea of what a life, an intuitive idea of a life that's worthy, right? We might differ on lots of ways, but I think there's certain kinds of a shared notion of this intuition. At least this is what Nussbaum's saying. You could quibble with it, but at least have a good grasp of what she's bringing to the table and not really arguing for. So she's interested in this philosophical approach. She thinks it works better than other ways. So she doesn't discount other ways and say don't do those. She's just saying that we need philosophy as well. And she's trying to come up with this basic, or again, this is just sketching it. She'll flesh this out later. This basic social minimum of what is sort of this kind of life. And she wants to ground it very much like Aristotle in terms of human functions, capabilities, right? And he tries to say, let's get a list of this. And if we were asking, what, people should have in life to have this respect for their dignity, and some kind of life that conforms to this intuitive idea. We could talk about, what is the good and go a la Plato and all that. But Aristotle said, yeah, we're friends of Plato, but we're friends of the truth more, and we think it's probably a better way to talk about human functions and capability. And Nussbaum is in that camp, so she's got a little smattering of Kant going on, a little smattering of Aristotle. Why not take from the good from the good stuff? And so like what are human beings actually capable of, right? What are the things that they can do, and look at that to try and build this notion of a basic social minimum. Because if we could get a list of this, we probably could, she says, agree on this kind of a list, this approach, this kind of quasi-Aristotelian approach, rather than looking at the good and saying, oh, well, let's talk and see if we can come to an agreement on the good. Well, good luck. That's a pretty tough one. So this one might be a better way of achieving that universalist goal of looking at what actually are human beings capable of. She hasn't told us anything yet. She's just, again, laying out the approach. So it is a philosophically informed but fairly empirical line. But yes, human dignity, that's not something you're going to see in a microscope, right? That's a philosophical concept. That's a moral concept. And dare I say it, even a metaphysical concept. She's got that in her work. But she's trying to minimize that by going through this human capabilities approach to see if we can and more likely agree on it. And we would also say something like anybody who's not sort of meeting all their capabilities, there would be kind of a threshold where we'd say if people aren't allowed to, function and according to human capabilities, like just for the sake of discussion, having some kind of training, mental training or mental stimulation, right? We would say that's not meeting a threshold. That person is not getting any education of any kind, like nothing. We would say that's falling under a threshold. That's not really meeting what we would say is proper respect for their dignity, and meeting this intuitive idea. So you can think of it like that. So certain capabilities, if they're not allowed to be, if a person is not getting any opportunity to exercise them, they would be falling under this threshold, and they're not living a truly functioning human life. Okay, so again, she says we're going to treat everyone as an end, and because women have often been subordinated, which is what she was talking up here, right? That their basic needs are not being met. They're under this threshold. They're not getting to exercise their capabilities. They've been subordinated. They're not being treated as ends. To treat everyone, a la Kant, as an end and not a means, this is going to have, as a principle, this has a big impact on women. Now, Martha Nussbaum refers to, this is a feminist approach. And I'm by no means a feminist scholar, but I do know enough that there are varieties of approaches. Well, and that's part of the course of name pretty well any discipline. There's always different angles and notions of it. So there's different ways of understanding what feminism is up to. And so she says that she's got her particular way of looking at this her feminist angle, but she gives a couple critiques of sort of standard feminism, for lack of a better term, or other ways of doing feminism. She says, there's the kind of feminism that avoids all abstraction, and in that sense, this kind of feminism that avoids all abstraction, is like really sensitive. Abstraction is kind of, a bad thing because it leads into, certain kinds of hegemony and imperialism and things like that. And they're false abstractions. So they're particularizations masquerading as abstractions that can then lead people who think that they're universal, but they're just really enforcing particulars. And that's a kind of imperialism. And she says, look, nonetheless, avoiding all abstraction is not a good idea because we need abstraction in order to have real thoughtful discourse. We can't get away from it, right? Thoughtful discourse and rational discourse is kind of shot through with abstractions. Think about math and all these kinds of things. You really need it, but nonetheless, you also want to be not carried away by these abstractions. So you don't want to avoid them. You want to bring them in the right kind, But you also don't want to be too influenced by abstractions, which she thinks certain feminists thought that's been heavily influenced by postmodernism, which gets carried away, so to speak, as Nussbaum says, by abstractions and sort of disengages language from the world and becomes just this pure study of language, and then gets caught up and regards everything as completely political, and there's no little contact left with the world. And she's like, no, that's not a good idea. So you don't want to have it where you avoid all abstraction nor get caught up in it. You want the right kind of abstraction, which is what she thinks is sort of a politically informed, philosophically informed kind of abstraction that takes into account, the salient things of human experience. And that's why she says she's going to concentrate on she talks a lot about India and developing nations in order to formulate this list of human capabilities. So we have to, she says, focus on real cases with real people, real women here, and not lose sight of it in all these abstractions or get so immersed that we're just talking about particulars. Because remember, she wants a universalist approach to this whole notion of capability. So she doesn't want to just talk about one region, but is using developing nations as sort of the empirical groundwork, salient sort of things that are going on there in order to construct a political / philosophical notion of this capabilities approach, which will have this universalist feature in the end. And we need that sort of that combination that is getting the abstraction in the right kind. So that's her basic. And in the next video, I'll talk a little bit of how she links up some of her stuff and her thinking with another philosopher. But that's for the next video. Stay tuned.